Hello and welcome to your daily mobile game sizzle with me, Jon Jordan. Today we are talking about Nexon. So Nexon has released its financial figures for the whole of 2016. Nexon is a big free-to-play publisher, mainly PC, also PC and mobile, and originally was Korean, but now it's floated on the Japanese stock exchange, so we can see it as a good bellwether of what's going on in the Korean and the Japanese markets. Okay, so let's look at a graph of what's been going on with Nexon over the last 3 years. It looks complicated, but actually fairly straightforward. So if you look at the first, the top line, the red line, that shows the percentage of Nexon's overall sales that come from mobile. So we can see in 2014 it was looking just under the 20% mark, maybe a bit over. 2015 we definitely see a big spike, and then it drops down again. 2016 we're back up. So Nexon's mobile sales are going in the right direction in the sense of the percentage of the overall company, so it's heading for 30%. Of course, percentages by themselves don't mean very much, so let's look at some absolute figures. So if you look at the next line down, the thinner kind of pinky yellow line, that's the line of Nexon's overall mobile revenue. So you can see it's kind of floating around the 10 billion yen mark, and again we can see there's an up click in the middle of 2015, and again towards the end of 2016 it's heading in the upwards direction. Obviously those kind of things are driven by specific games, and in the case of Nexon it had a very big game in 2015 in Korea called Hit, and that game has gone live globally in 2016, and particularly not done particularly well in the West, but in other Asian markets it's done quite well, so that's why we're seeing an increase in Nexon's mobile sales. However, for me, what's really interesting is the bottom bar columns, and they show how Nexon's mobile revenue has switched from Japan to Korea. So a bit of backstory on that. Nexon made a very big transaction to buy a Japanese mobile game developer called Gloops, and that's why at the start of 2014 you see the red bars are much higher. That's basically the revenue coming from the Gloops transaction. Now, over the 3-year period, we can see the Japanese revenues are dropping. That's partly, or that's mainly, because Gloops was a terrible transaction for Nexon. So Gloops was mainly dealing with kind of browser mobile games and wasn't set up to deal with the explosion in smartphone games in Japan. So from 2014 into 2015 in the Japanese market we've seen the rise of games like Puzzle and Dragons from Gung Ho, and also more recently now Monster Strike from Mixi, and those are billion-dollar games just from the Japanese market, and they are smartphone games, so native apps, and that's really what Gloops hasn't been able to deal with, and so we've seen kind of the sales from the Gloops company owned by Nexon, basically their Japanese revenue, dropping quite considerably during the 3-year period. In contrast, if we look at the blue bars, that's the revenue coming from the Korean market. So the Korean market is, you could argue, something that Nexon knows best, because they were started out as a Korean company and still have lots of their development staff in Korea. So we can see, particularly at the end of 2015, we have these two big columns, and that's when this Hit game came out and did very well. Again, kind of drop off at the start of 2016, then picking up again to the end of 2016, not quite at the same level as the end of 2015, but we can just see how Nexon's mobile revenue has changed between these two companies. The interesting thing to note is that it's still Japan and Korea that are the bulk of Nexon's mobile revenue. So even though it has done some acquisitions in the West, so it bought Big Huge Games, company behind Domination, that's quite a nice mobile strategy game, and it has set up a company called Nexon M, which is basically their North American branch, just handling mobile games. They haven't seen a massive success out of that market yet. And this, I think, is the takeaway from Nexon's financials over the last 3 years. Despite the massive growth of mobile free-to-play, it hasn't really happened for Nexon. So, okay, it's up to 30% of its sales now come from mobile. But if you look in absolute terms, it hasn't been an explosion in free-to-play mobile revenue for Nexon. And that's partly because the PC side of its business is just so big, and I think that's always what it's focused on, and it's just not had that breakout hit. It had the game Hit, which was a kind of small hit in Korea, or a fairly big hit in Korea, but didn't go big anywhere else. And that's really the issue for Nexon, is during this period of time it hasn't had a big billion-dollar hit. So the business is doing okay, but they have invested a lot in the mobile side of their business, and I don't really think they've seen any sufficient outcome from that investment, at least to date.